He was a billionaire CEO until a setup turned him into a fugitive. Then a poor lady did this. Arthur Sterling was a billionaire CEO who hadn't walked alone in 10 years. So, the night he slipped out without guards, he didn't know it was a mistake. 12 minutes later, a black sedan jumped the curb. Doors slammed open. Men in tactical gear grabbed him. Arthur fought, ripped free, ran bleeding through alleys, dropping his phone, his wallet, his entire identity. Moments earlier, he owned everything. Now he owned nothing. Rain fell. Footsteps closed in. He reached one door, and behind it was Sarah, a woman with nothing to gain, who risked everything to save the most powerful man in the city. The air in the Sterling penthouse always tasted like filtered oxygen and expensive silence. Arthur stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the city of Chicago like a king inspecting a map. But he didn't feel like a king. He felt like a target. For months, whispers of a shadow war had reached his ears, rivals moving in the dark, stocks being manipulated, and threats that arrived in unmarked envelopes. His security detail, led by a man named Miller, was a constant shadow. They timed his movements. They cleared his paths. They dictated when he breathed and where he stood. It was a cage made of gold, but it was still a cage. Arthur's need for freedom of movement wasn't just a whim, it was a survival instinct. He needed to remember what it felt like to be a man, not a corporate asset. He waited until the shift change, a 3-minute window where the cameras in the service corridor cycled through their reboot. He didn't take his encrypted phone. He didn't take his emergency beacon. He didn't even take his wallet. He wanted to be a ghost. He stepped out into the humid evening air, the heavy scent of rain and asphalt hitting him like a physical blow. For the first time in a decade, Arthur Sterling was invisible, or so he thought. The freedom lasted exactly 12 minutes. Arthur was walking through a transitional neighborhood, the transition from high-rises to low-income housing, when the silence of the street was shattered. A black sedan with tinted windows jumped the curb, its tires screaming against the concrete. Before Arthur could even register the danger, the doors flew open. 3 men in tactical gear lunged toward him. They didn't shout commands, they moved with a professional, lethal efficiency. Arthur wasn't a fighter by trade, but the adrenaline of a man who has everything to lose took over. He fought with a primal ferocity, his movements frantic and unrefined. One man grabbed his designer jacket, trying to pin his arms. Arthur twisted, the expensive fabric tearing as he managed to slip out of the garment and leave it in the kidnapper's hands. He didn't look back. He ran. He scrambled over a rusted chain-link fence, the metal tearing at his palms, and vanished into the labyrinth of a nearby ghetto. Behind him, he heard his phone shatter on the pavement and the heavy thud of his wallet hitting the mud. In the span of 60 seconds, the man with $1 billion in the bank had become a man without a cent in his pocket. Rain began to fall, turning the grime of the alleyways into a slick, treacherous slurry. Arthur's lungs burned. Every shadow looked like a hitman. Every distant engine sounded like his death warrant. He was covered in grime and bleeding from the scuffle, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stumbled toward a crumbling apartment building, the brickwork stained by decades of neglect. He pounded on a weathered wooden door, his fists shaking. He had no plan, no identity, and no backup. The door creaked open a few inches, held by a heavy security chain. Sarah, a woman whose eyes held the weary strength of someone who lived paycheck to paycheck, looked at him with hesitation. She saw a man who looked like he had crawled out of a wreck, eyes wide with genuine terror. Behind Arthur, at the end of the alley, the silhouettes of the armed men appeared, their flashlights cutting through the rain. Sarah saw them. She saw the man in front of her. In a split-second decision that would change the course of both their lives, she unlatched the chain and pulled him inside. She led him to a narrow, cramped space behind her water heater, pushing him into the dark just as the heavy boots of the kidnappers thudded past her door. The darkness behind the water heater was absolute, smelling of rusted iron and damp concrete. Arthur pressed his back against the vibrating metal, his heart hammering so loudly against his ribs that he was certain the men in the hallway could hear it. Every muscle in his body was coiled, waiting for the door to be kicked off its hinges. On the other side of the thin wall, the heavy thud of tactical boots came to a halt. He heard the muffled voices of his pursuers. They were cold, professional, and frustrated. They spoke in short bursts about the asset and losing the trail. Arthur realized with a jolt of terror that he wasn't just a man to them. He was a piece of property they had failed to secure. He held his breath until his lungs screamed for air, listening as the footsteps eventually faded toward the stairwell. Sarah didn't come for him immediately. She waited, standing by her window and watching the street until the black sedan finally pulled away from the curb. When she finally opened the small door to his hiding spot, her face was a mask of cautious concern. She didn't ask for his name, and she didn't ask why men with guns were hunting him. She simply reached out a hand and helped the billionaire stand up from the grime of her floor. The kitchen was small, lit by a single flickering bulb that cast long, amber shadows across the cracked linoleum. Sarah moved with a practiced, quiet efficiency. She didn't have a high-tech medical suite like the one in Arthur's penthouse, but she had a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. As she began to wash the dirt and blood from the scrapes on his arms, Arthur winced, the sting of the water grounding him in a reality he had never known. He looked around the room, taking in the details of a life lived on the edge of survival. There were coupons clipped on the counter and a jar of coins labeled for emergencies. He felt a wave of profound displacement. 24 hours ago, he was deciding the fate of a billion-dollar merger. Now, he was grateful for a bowl of generic soup and a stranger's kindness. Sarah's hands were steady as she applied basic antiseptic to his wounds. She noticed the quality of his undershirt, the fine silk that had survived the scuffle, and the way he carried himself even in his broken state. She knew he belonged to the world of glass towers and power lunches, a world that rarely looked down at people like her. Yet, she treated his injuries with a tenderness that no amount of money could buy. As the adrenaline finally began to ebb, the gravity of Arthur's situation settled over him like a lead shroud. He looked at the shadows dancing on the wall and realized the true extent of his isolation. He had no way to call his head of security, no way to access his bank accounts, and no way to verify who he could actually trust. He explained to Sarah in hushed tones that they couldn't risk using her phone or any device connected to a network. He knew the capabilities of the tracking software his company had developed, software that could triangulate a signal within seconds of a call being placed. If his enemies had access to the Sterling Tech mainframe, every cell tower in the city was effectively a trap. For the first time in his life, Arthur Sterling was truly off the grid. He wasn't just hiding from kidnappers, he was hiding from his own creation. He lay low on a small sofa in the corner of the room, watching the sun begin to bleed through the tattered curtains. He felt the fickle and fleeting nature of his former life, how easily a king could be stripped of his crown and left with nothing but his breath and the kindness of a stranger. The sun rose over the city, but it didn't bring the clarity Arthur had hoped for. He sat at Sarah's small kitchen table, his body aching from the previous night's struggle. Sarah turned on her flickering television, the volume low to avoid drawing attention from the hallway. Arthur expected to see a frantic search for a missing billionaire, a manhunt for the men who had jumped the curb in the black sedan. Instead, the screen filled with his own face. The headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen chilled him to his core. CEO Arthur Sterling involved in fatal hit and run, currently a fugitive. The news anchor spoke with a practiced gravity, describing a horrific accident that had occurred at the exact time Arthur was fighting for his life in the alleyway. Arthur stared at the screen, paralyzed. He realized the kidnapping attempt wasn't just a botched ransom plot or a move by a rival company. It was something much more calculated. Someone had framed him for a crime he didn't commit to strip him of his legal protection and turn him into a wanted man. The realization hit Arthur like a physical blow. By going to the police now, he wouldn't be a victim seeking protection. He would be a high-profile fugitive walking straight into a prison cell or a carefully laid trap. The system he had always navigated with ease had been weaponized against him. He looked at Sarah, who was watching him with a new, sharper intensity. He couldn't trust the authorities, and he realized with growing dread that he couldn't call his office either. He didn't know who had turned against him, or which of his loyal executives had orchestrated the frame-up. The invisible enemy wasn't just in the black sedan, they were in the boardrooms and the precinct offices. For the first time in his life, the man who had built a global empire was truly alone, trapped in a narrative he didn't write. He was a billionaire without a penny, a CEO without a company, and an innocent man with the whole world looking for him as a killer. The tension in the small apartment became a living thing. Every siren in the distance felt like it was coming for Arthur, and every footstep in the corridor sounded like a bounty hunter. He explained the situation to Sarah in a low, urgent voice, describing the fatal hit-and-run that never happened. He realized that his freedom of movement had led him into a deeper cage than the one he had escaped. His rivals hadn't just tried to take his life, they were trying to erase his legacy and his soul. As the hours ticked by, Arthur sat in the shadows, his eyes fixed on the door. He began to understand that the kidnapping was just the first move in a much larger game of chess. He had been played by someone who knew his every habit, someone who knew he would seek a moment of freedom and used it to destroy him. He was no longer just a man hiding, he was a ghost trying to find a way back to the land of the living. As the afternoon light faded into a murky grey, Arthur felt the weight of his helplessness. Sarah had been quiet, moving around the apartment with a somber grace that felt at odds with the chaos of his mind. She had just finished rewrapping the scrape on his forearm when she stepped away to answer a quiet knock at her door. It was a neighbor dropping off a stack of mail. Sarah set the pile on the kitchen table, and as she moved to the stove, a thick manila folder slid from the top and hit the floor with a heavy thud. Arthur instinctively reached down to help. As he picked it up, the bold lettering on the tab caught his eye. Sterling Tech, class action litigation. His breath hitched. He slowly opened the folder to find dozens of documents, medical reports, and internal company memos he recognized all too well. They weren't just papers, they were a record of a battle against his own company for environmental poisoning in this very neighborhood. He looked up at Sarah, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. She wasn't just a random Good Samaritan who had happened to open her door to a stranger. She was a victim of the very empire he had built. She had been fighting his legal team for years while he sat in his glass tower, insulated from the human cost of his profit margins. Sarah turned around, seeing the folder in his hands. There was no anger in her eyes, only a profound, weary sadness. She didn't try to take the folder back. Instead, she sat down across from him, the flickering light of the kitchen bulb reflecting in her eyes. "I knew who you were the moment I saw your face at the door," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Arthur felt a wave of shame so intense it made his hands shake. He had spent his life thinking of the public as a set of data points and litigation as a line item on a spreadsheet. But here was the human reality. Sarah had lost family to the illnesses caused by his factories. She had spent her meager savings on lawyers who were outmatched by his corporate machine. "Why?" Arthur managed to ask, his voice cracking. "Why would you save me after everything I've done to your people?" Sarah looked at her hands, her voice steady. "Because I'm not you," she replied. "Because if I let those men take you, I'd be just as cold as the man who signed those memos." This realization shattered Arthur's worldview. He saw the fickle and fleeting nature of the life he had led, a kingdom built on the suffering of people like the woman now protecting him. In that small, quiet apartment, the power dynamic shifted completely. Arthur was no longer the billionaire, and Sarah was no longer the victim. They were simply two souls caught in the teeth of the same machine. As the night deepened, they talked, not about stocks or litigation, but about loss, regret, and the strange way fate had brought them together. Arthur began to see the world through her eyes. He saw the strength it took to survive in a neighborhood his company had helped to decay. He felt a deep, raw honesty growing between them, a connection that felt more real than any relationship he had ever known in his world of high society galas and strategic alliances. Despite the darkness outside and the hit squad searching the streets, Arthur felt a strange sense of peace. He was falling in love with the one person who had every reason to hate him. They were both being hunted now, him by his treacherous colleagues and her by the poverty his company had perpetuated. As they sat in the shadows, leaning against each other for warmth, Arthur realized that he was finally finding the freedom of movement he had craved. But it wasn't a physical journey. It was a movement of the heart. The atmosphere inside the apartment had shifted from one of pure survival to a shared, heavy intimacy. Arthur watched Sarah as she moved through the dim light, realizing that the fickle and fleeting nature of his old life had been a mirage. For years he had measured success by the height of his towers, but in the silence of Sarah's kitchen, he understood that true strength was measured by the weight one could carry for others. They sat close together, the hum of the old refrigerator the only sound in the room. Arthur spoke of his childhood, of a time before the suits and the boardrooms, while Sarah shared stories of the community he had only ever seen as a project site. He realized that while he had been the target of a shadow war, Sarah had been fighting a very real war for basic dignity every single day. In this shared vulnerability, the barriers of class and history began to dissolve. They weren't just a billionaire and a worker anymore. They were two people hunted by the same machine. As the clock on the wall ticked toward midnight, Arthur felt a resolve he had never known. He wasn't just going to survive this for himself, he was going to survive it for her. Arthur began to look at Sarah's legal folder not as a threat, but as a roadmap of his own failures. He saw the names of families affected by Sterling Tech's negligence and realized that the freedom of movement he had sought was a luxury they never had. His company had effectively caged this neighborhood, just as surely as his security detail had caged him. He began to formulate a plan, but it wasn't a corporate strategy. It was a mission for redemption. He explained to Sarah that the only way to break the cycle was to strike at the heart of the betrayal. He needed to prove his innocence regarding the hit-and-run frame-up, but he also needed to ensure that the people responsible for the environmental poisoning were finally held accountable. Sarah listened, her eyes searching his. She saw the change in him, the way the arrogant mask of a CEO had been replaced by the raw determination of a man who had finally seen the truth. She agreed to help him, not for a reward, but because she believed for the first time that the man sitting in her kitchen was capable of being the hero his PR team had always claimed he was. The plan required precision and a total lack of fear. Arthur knew he couldn't just walk into a police station. The invisible enemy likely had ears in every precinct. He needed to create a spectacle that couldn't be ignored, a digital and physical trap that would force the truth into the light. He spent the early hours of the morning working with Sarah's old, outdated technology. He was a pioneer of tech, and now he was using Sarah's old tech to build a digital Trojan horse. He bypassed encrypted servers and set up a live streaming loop that would broadcast to every major news outlet once triggered. As they prepared to move, the gravity of the risk settled over them. If they failed, Arthur would either be dead or behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, and Sarah would be left to face the consequences of aiding a fugitive. But as they looked at each other in the pre-dawn light, there was no hesitation. They had risked it all for each other, and now they were ready to risk it all for justice. Arthur sat hunched over Sarah's outdated laptop, the screen's low-resolution glow reflecting in his tired eyes. He wasn't just coding, he was hunting. He realized that to clear his name of the fatal hit-and-run frame-up, he needed more than just a denial. He needed the truth that only his own company's secure servers held. He navigated through layers of firewalls he himself had commissioned, his fingers moving with a rhythmic intensity as he bypassed the security protocols of Sterling Tech. He managed to pinpoint the exact location of his private vehicle on the night of the kidnapping. He knew that the high-definition dashcam footage, which recorded 360 degrees of the car's surroundings, would prove he wasn't behind the wheel during the accident. But the data was being held in a dead-drop server, a digital vault that could only be opened by a high-ranking executive. Arthur realized that his CFO, the architect of his downfall, was likely monitoring that specific server for any activity. Instead of hiding, Arthur decided to use the server as a flare. He sent a single, encrypted ping from Sarah's IP address, knowing it would act as a beacon for the hit squad. He wasn't just looking for evidence anymore, he was setting the stage for a final confrontation. He looked at Sarah, who was watching him with a mixture of fear and pride. He was no longer the fugitive CEO, he was the engineer of his own redemption. Arthur used a burner phone to leak his location to a board member he once considered a mentor, claiming he was hiding at a specific deserted pier on the outskirts of the city. It was a calculated risk, a final trap designed to draw the enemies out of the shadows and into a place where they couldn't hide their true intentions. As he and Sarah drove toward the city center in her beat-up car, he monitored the pier through a remote live feed he had rigged. The feed showed a black sedan pulling onto the pier, the same model that had jumped the curb the night he was almost kidnapped. Men in tactical gear emerged, led by the trusted board member Arthur had just called. They weren't there for a rescue, they were there to finish the job. Arthur watched as they realized the pier was empty, save for a single live-streaming camera he had mounted on a piling. The camera wasn't just recording, it was broadcasting their faces and their conversation directly to the city's largest news networks and the central police station. The board member's frustration turned to panic as he realized he had been caught in a digital and physical pincer movement. Arthur had used his own freedom of movement to lure them into a cage they couldn't escape. While the hit squad was distracted at the empty pier, Arthur and Sarah arrived at the central police station. He didn't slip in through the back. He walked through the front doors, hands raised, into the bright light of the lobby. He wasn't the fugitive the news had portrayed. He was a man holding a drive containing the real evidence of his innocence and the identity of the frame-up. The air in the precinct was thick with tension as officers surrounded him. Arthur stayed calm, his voice steady as he demanded to see the lead investigator. He knew the live stream from the pier was already trending globally, making it impossible for any corrupt officials to bury the truth. He turned over the recovered dashcam footage, which clearly showed the CFO's henchmen staging the hit and run while Arthur was miles away, fighting for his life in a ghetto alleyway. The investigation was swift and scorched earth. Within hours, the CFO and his CO conspirators were arrested, their plot to seize Sterling Tech dismantled by the very evidence they tried to hide. Arthur had won the shadow war, but as he looked at Sarah waiting for him in the lobby, he realized that the victory wasn't in regaining his company. It was in the fact that he had risked everything, his life, his fortune, and his legacy, to protect the woman who had first protected him. The bright fluorescent lights of the police precinct felt clinical compared to the warm amber shadows of Sarah's apartment. As the sun climbed high over the city, the invisible enemy was finally unmasked. The investigation revealed that Arthur's own CFO had orchestrated the hit-and-run frame-up as a desperate play to seize the company and bury the evidence of environmental negligence. The culprits were brought to justice in a swift, scorched-earth legal battle that dominated the global news cycle. Arthur sat in a private room, the weight of the last 48 hours finally catching up to him. He was no longer a fugitive, and his fortune was back at his fingertips, but he felt a profound sense of detachment from the man he used to be. The fickle and fleeting nature of his former life had been exposed. He realized that while he had regained his name, he no longer wanted the throne that came with it. He looked at the digital records of his company's stock rebounding. To the world, it was a recovery. To Arthur, it was just numbers on a screen. His mind was elsewhere, on a narrow space behind a water heater and a woman who had saved him when he had nothing to offer in return. He knew that going back to the penthouse would be like stepping back into a cage, and this time the bars would be of his own making. To the shock of the financial world, Arthur Sterling did not return to his corner office. Instead of a victory lap, he issued a final directive that sent shockwaves through the industry. He sold his shares and liquidated his massive fortune, stepping down as CEO for good. He didn't just walk away with the money, he used that wealth to settle every single lawsuit against Sterling Tech, ensuring that the people in Sarah's neighborhood were finally compensated for the years of suffering his company had caused. He realized that his freedom of movement was only possible if he untethered himself from the machine that crushed others. He spent weeks overseeing the distribution of funds, turning his former empire into a foundation for urban renewal. He was dismantling his legacy to build something that actually mattered. For the first time, Arthur was using his power not to dominate, but to heal. The press called it the greatest corporate fall in history, but Arthur had never felt more successful. He moved his final belongings out of the penthouse in a single box. He didn't need the security detail, the encrypted phones, or the silk suits. He had traded his empire for something far more valuable, a clean conscience, and a reason to wake up in the morning. The story ended where the new one began, at the end of a dead-end street in a neighborhood the world had forgotten. Arthur returned to the crumbling apartment building, not as a billionaire, but as a man who had finally found his home. He disappeared back into the neighborhood, choosing a quiet life away from the cameras and the boardrooms. He and Sarah stood on her small balcony, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The shadow war was over, and the culprits were behind bars, but the real victory was the unshakable love they had forged in the dark. Arthur had risked everything, his life and his legacy, to ensure she was protected, and in doing so, he had saved himself. He finally understood what he had been searching for that night he slipped out of his mansion. It wasn't just a walk, it was a journey toward a life that made sense. He had traded his empire for a life with Sarah, finally finding the true freedom of movement he had been searching for. As the moon rose over the skyline, Arthur Sterling was no longer a ghost in a suit, he was a man who was finally truly alive. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Make sure to turn on all notifications by clicking the bell icon so you're the first to know whenever a new story drops. We post deep dive emotional stories like this multiple times every week. You won't want to miss our next one.